Genesis chapter 25, verses 19 to 34. Hear the word of the Lord. These are the generations of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham fathered Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel, the Aramean of Paddan Aram, the sister of Laban, the Aramean, to be his wife. And Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife because she was barren. And the Lord granted his prayer. And Rebekah, his wife, conceived. The children struggled together within her, and she said, "If it is thus, why is this happening to me?" So she went to inquire of the Lord, and the Lord said to her, "Two nations are in your womb, and two peoples from within you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other, the older shall serve the younger." When her days to give birth were completed, behold, there were twins in her womb. The first came out red, all his body like a hairy cloak, so that they called his name Esau. Afterward, his brother came out with his hand holding Esau's heel, so his name was called Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. When the boys grew up, Esau was a skilled hunter, a man of the field, while Jacob was a quiet man, dwelling in tents. Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Once when Jacob was cooking stew, Esau came in from the field, and he was exhausted. And Esau said to Jacob, "Let me eat some of that red stew, for I am exhausted." Therefore his name was called Edom. Jacob said, "Sell me your birthright now." Esau said, "I am about to die. Of what use is a birthright to me?" Jacob said, "Swear to me now." So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew, and he ate and drank and rose up and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. May the Lord add his blessings to the reading of his holy word. Well, are you the kind that likes to know how something works? You're not content just to know that it does. You want to know how it works, understand what makes it run, so you can master it, so you could produce it if you had the materials. You could fix it if you need to. You each drove a car here. You want to know how the engine works? That way you can master it. You can be your own mechanic. Modern science was originally begun by Christians who believed that God had created the universe in an orderly way, that every sunrise and sunset wasn't just some random, mysterious miracle, like Apollo riding his chariot across the sky every day, but somehow part of the laws, the natural laws that God put in place. And so the Puritans called nature God's other book. So set out to study how it works. Just like you study the Bible, God wrote it in an intelligible way, so you can study it. The Puritans figured God created the universe in an intelligible way, so you could study it and figure it out. We have inoculations because a Puritan pastor, Cotton Mather, thought that there must be a way diseases work. They can be understood and then mastered. Now, some people then began to believe that everything can be reduced to laws, like the laws of physics, and then mastered. And so the outcome we can produce every time. Whatever it is we want, we can reproduce it over and over again. In the 19th century, the American poet Edgar Allan Poe wrote an essay about how anyone could write a great poem, like his famous The Raven, quote, "The raven, nevermore," if they just follow the laws of poetry. It's not really genius or inspiration, it's just follow certain laws. And now even great literature doesn't need inspiration. You only need to follow the right steps. Of course, that even Poe couldn't churn out great poem after great poem should have been a clue that things are just not so easy. Now AI is proving that, sure, you can program it to mimic literature, to produce something like a poem, yeah, always mediocre. It can produce something that looks like literature, but it can't produce anything original and great. You can program it with the techniques. You can't inspire it. How does it work? Modern people believe everything can be understood and boiled down to steps we can follow. And so the revivalist in the 19th century, Charles Finney, applied the same thinking to revival and conversions. Revivals can be understood, and salvation can be understood and produced, reproduced at will, he thought, like the culture, that everything can be studied, it can be understood and mastered, and you can do it when you want to do it, reproduce it. Finney said, quote, "For a long time, it was supposed by the church that a revival was a miracle, an interposition of divine power with which they had nothing to do, and which they had no more agency in producing than they had in producing thunder or a storm of hail or an earthquake. It is only within a few years, means the last few years of his time, that ministers generally have supposed that revivals were to be promoted by the use of means designed and adapted specially to that object. That is, now, Finney is thinking, like Benjamin Franklin, flew a kite in a thunderstorm, discovered that, hey, the lightning isn't just like some mysterious supernatural thing. It's made out of electricity. And then once you figure that, you can learn how to master it and use it. Now we've begun to understand how revival works, how people are saved. And now Finney thought, and many others thought also, that you could study that, you could master the laws of revival and of salvation, the means, he calls them, in other words, the way that revival, salvation comes, and then you can reproduce it at will. We can then churn out salvations, like an assembly line. The unsaved come in through this way, we soften them up with the music, we preach at them, whether the old-fashioned hellfire and brimstone or the new way, sitting on a stool with a turtleneck sweater and a cup of coffee in one hand, chatting winsomely. Whatever, that's just style, but the philosophy is the same. We can cry a little, turn on the invitation music, give them a repeat after me sinner's prayer, and send them on their way, now saved. That's how it works, they thought. Of course, that's not really new with Finney. People have been from the beginning thinking they can understand and master how salvation works, how God works. And we'll look at that today through this passage, the second half of Genesis chapter 25, looking at how people have thought he works, either through one of three ways, people think, either through connections or through compensation or through consequences. And then we'll see how Genesis 25 really shows us that God works and brings salvation through compassion. How does it work? How are people saved? How are they accepted by God? A covenant with God? Many people think it is because of connections. After the first half of Genesis 25, people think that God works through Abraham, the friend of God, and Isaac, the supernatural son. His covenant is through them. So from now on, they think, if you want a covenant with God, you want a relationship with God, you want to be right with him, you need to have those physical connections. That's how you get it. And so we follow the generations. Our passage begins in verse 19. He has his wife Rebekah from the extended family. It recounts that for us. There's names like Laban. In verse 20, remember he got her providentially. But oddly enough, just the right woman that God provided. Remember all that? She was infertile too. What are the chances? Well, just like his mother. And so Isaac has to pray for the covenant to continue. And God grants that. In verse 21, she has twins who are tussling inside her, causing her to seek God as to why. In verse 22, and God answers her with a word that is the key to understanding how salvation works. It's quoted for us in Romans chapter 9. Well, then she gives birth first to a hairy reddish baby, the elder, named after his red tint, Esau. He's Mr. Red. And then to another one clinging to his brother's heel, Jacob. But only one of them gets the covenant with God. And it's not by connections. Many people believe that God accepts them because they're born with the right connections. They're born into the right family or join the right church. And this passage in Genesis 25 is pointed to as proof by some that they were born into the right ethnic group. We came from him. That's where God is connected to. They think a covenant with God, salvation, acceptance with God, is inherited simply by God accepting the whole family. And they happen to be in that family. Good for them, right? They're lucky. It's like the guy who gets into an Ivy League college, not because he did great on the SATs, but because his father went there and his father's father. He had a legacy there. Fraternities often accept guys as legacy admissions, they call them. They have connections. And some people get jobs because their father is friends with the boss. They go golfing with the CEO. They get connections. And so some think, well, God works the same way. He has legacy admissions into heaven. Doesn't matter what you believe, how you live. Yeah, you're connected to him. Yeah, you're in. That's why the New Testament begins by really just exploding this idea. Almost the first teaching that comes from a public person teaching is attacking this very idea. John the Baptist declares to those trusting in their connections that God can make rocks into children of Abraham. They were boasting, we have connections with God. We're descended from Abraham through Jacob. And John the Baptist, think that is worth to God. It's like the rocks. He can do that with the rocks. Because ethnic connections are no more meaningful, John the Baptist says, than rocks. In the book of Romans, chapter 9, Paul is explaining how salvation works and comes to this very point using this very chapter in Genesis 25. Now, some say that it's all connections, that they are children of Abraham and Jacob, who was later called Israel, and so they're connected to God. They get the covenants. That's how it works, they say. But Paul writes in Romans chapter 9, verse 6, literally translated, "For not all who are of Israel are of Israel." Not all who are of Israel, that is, they have the family connections. They are descended from him, from the literal Abraham and Jacob, literal Israel. But not all of those with those physical connections are, Paul says, are of the true Israel, God's people. And then Paul points out in Romans chapter 9, verse 7, the very next verse, and he's commentating on Genesis chapter 25, this passage. Not all are children of Abraham because they are his offspring. You think what a weird phrase that is. Think about that. If you just interpret it all literally, it makes no sense. Not all are children of Abraham because they are his offspring. I mean, the definition of an offspring is to be the child of someone. But he's saying, no, not really. Remember the sons of Abraham and Keturah? They had literal connections with Abraham. They're given gifts. They're sent away, sent back to where Abraham came from. And then there's Ishmael. He had excellent connections. He's a son of Abraham and the surrogate of Sarah. But he dies outside the promised land. Only Isaac is the one through whom God works salvation. And of course, some would say, well, that's okay, because I have connections through Isaac. I don't just stop with Abraham. I'm not one of those other children Abraham had. I'm through Isaac. But we see in our passage today that not even all of Isaac's sons inherit the promise. That is, God does not choose all the sons of Isaac either. Only Jacob, Israel. And if they say, well, that's okay, because I'm descended from Jacob, I'm of Jacob, Paul says, you don't get the point. You don't get the point of what Genesis 25 was teaching all along. Paul writes in Romans chapter 9, verse 8, it is not the children of the flesh, in other words, physically descended with the connections, who are the children of God, but the children of the promise are counted as offspring. In other words, physical ancestry, having a literal legacy, connections through family, does not make you one of God's children. When God says in verse 23, the older will serve the younger, he was showing that the usual laws of how things work, you inherit the connections, you inherit the birthright, especially if you're the firstborn, those do not apply. That is not how salvation works. Now, Christians forget this when they think that they are accepted because of their family connections. Almost all Christians will agree with that, what I just said, when it comes maybe to the Jews. Yeah, they're not descended because of their physical connections, but we are, because our family are believers in Jesus. So if I'm born into it, I'm one of God's people. Some say that just as one in the Old Testament was in a covenant with God because their parents had connections, they were Israelites, so they inherited it, so they had a legacy, or birthright, the term used here in this passage. Well, they say, well, it's the same today. We can inherit a covenant with God. No, they don't, but we can. So I don't know. That's what they say. In the Old Testament, they showed the birthright if they were male by being circumcised, and so they were in a covenant with God, and God accepted them because of that. That's how acceptance with God works. Your parents believed and gave you the mark of the covenant as a little baby, and so you are now, by those connections, accepted by God. It's a birthright. In other words, a right simply by birth. And so today, we have some who say, well, okay, how does the covenant with God work? How does it work? Well, just like in the Old Testament, it's a birthright we can inherit. Except they're wrong about the Old Testament too, but never mind that. That's what they say. They say it's a birthright that we can inherit. Your parents believed it, and so God accepts whole households, and they give you what they call the new sign of the covenant, which is now, they say, baptism. Now, the Bible never calls baptism a sign of the covenant. Often when they're saying this, they will just sneak that in there like it's a fact. Well, baptism is a sign of the covenant, like circumcision, so therefore, and they go on, wait, prove that baptism is a sign of the covenant, like circumcision. Where's the Bible ever say that? It doesn't. The Bible never calls baptism a sign of the covenant, like circumcision, but they do. And so they say you are accepted by God, at least to some degree, somehow. You have some advantage, some covenant, even though they never specifically explain what that means. It's kind of ambiguous. And so they baptize babies, what they call baptism. They don't really baptize them either because baptism means immersion, but never mind that. Saying this ritual gives the baby connections with God. He is born in the right family. But the same principle Paul finds in Genesis 25 applies to us too. It's not the children of the flesh who are the children of God. It's not physical connections or a literal birthright. It's God's grace. This means for us, God has no grandchildren. You could have the most faithful, godly parents, but if you do not have faith in Christ personally, if you are not a born-again child of God, that connection does you no good. Well, in some ways, it makes it worse for you. It means you were exposed to the gospel. You should know. You should have seen it. And yet, you still didn't believe. Turns out to be a point of judgment for you. If you personally do not have faith, you are disconnected from God. This is why if you have children, grandchildren, you should be eagerly or earnestly, persistently in prayer for your children or grandchildren, that they become God's children. Don't just assume that they are. They're born to me. I'm a Christian, so they are. No. Seek to expose them to the gospel as much as possible. Get them to church. Get them in the way of grace, as the Puritans would say. So they're hearing a lot about grace because of the environment you put them in. Teach them by example that believing and loving God is more important than making money or being an athlete. They can't go to church because they got these games to go. No, show them by practical example. Church, the gospel, more important than athletics. Or a scholar. They got to stay home and study. No. They need to be where they hear the gospel. Esau despised his birthright by treating it like it was worth less than a bowl of stew. Show that you do not despise the gospel by treating it as worth more than making a few more dollars, winning a game, getting better grades. Be more concerned for your children's connection to God, which comes through faith in the gospel, than you are for what college they will get into or what career they will take, how much money they will make. How does it work? Well, second, some people say it works through compensation. People are saved, accepted by God, because they earn it. We think God is like us, and we know for someone to get something from us, well, they have to do something for us. This is the way it is. Most people, maybe there's exceptions. Your family, your church should be an exception. For most people, though, they want something from us. They got to do something for us. If they want us to work for 8 hours, well, they better pay us. So we imagine that if we want pay from God, paid with favor, then with blessings, with healing, with prosperity, with salvation, with heaven, we want that benefit from God. We realize, we think kind of instinctively, that we better provide some service for him. We better do something for God so he'll do something for us. So he'll compensate us. That's what we're after. We're after God's compensation. So maybe we think we'll keep his laws. We'll go to church. That'll earn something from him, some points. We'll tithe. Pay the tithe, some people talk about. That way he'll give us more back, right? They're not really giving. They're investing when they talk like that. We'll be nice and moral, maybe even religious. We think God is like Isaac here in verse 28. Yeah, Isaac loved Esau. This is really bad of Isaac. Think about this. Isaac loved Esau because he was his son, unconditional love? No, because he ate of his game. He liked the food he was getting from his son. Isaac likes that fresh venison that Esau is good at catching. And so he prefers his son Esau over that good-for-nothing Jacob. What does Jacob do for me? Nothing. He just hangs around the tents. He's a quiet man in verse 28. Or whatever he was doing, Rebekah liked him for that. Maybe he was chatting with her all the time. Esau does something for him, and so is compensated with favor. And that's the way most of our relationships are. That's how we get food to put on the table, right? We do something for our employer. He gives us compensation. We can buy food. Money to pay the rent or the mortgage. We work, and so we are compensated. And it's natural for us to think the same way about God. That's how it works. That's how the world works. But this passage shows us that God does not work that way. He accepted Jacob before he was even born. Jacob and Esau are wrestling even as babies in the womb in verse 28, and Rebekah was astonished at what was happening inside her, and so she prays. Literally, it's an incomplete, stammering plea. In Hebrew is, why this? Why is this happening to me? And the Lord responds to her directly, telling her in verse 23, 2 nations are in you, both descendants. Now, both of the babies in her are descendants of Abraham and Isaac. They're both, you would think, would get the promises to Abraham, have those connections. But God says they will be divided. And from before they are even born, the Lord declares that the older will serve the younger. That's totally contrary to their culture, where the oldest always with the chief heir. Even here, when they're twins, you think, how are they older? Well, even by just a minute, they're older. But still, he's the chief heir. He gets all the inheritance, whatever the father has. Now, this time, though, God will do something different. He's violating the conventions of their society. Right? People think God works by compensation. Some people think he works by conventions. He works in the traditions of your culture. Well, God here says, no, I'm not going to do it that way. God works outside of their conventions to prove that it is he who is choosing. It's not just the culture that arbitrarily came up with this. The older, even if they're twins, that's kind of ridiculous to me, but whatever. Even if the older still gets the inheritance. God says, no, I'm not going to, I'm violating your conventions, your culture. This isn't the usual predictable laws of society doing this. This is something outside of the control of human convention, human culture. And most importantly, it was announced before Jacob was born, had done anything for God to show that the covenant with God, that he believed in that covenant with God, that he wanted that relationship with God, to show that salvation does not come through compensation, to show that Jacob didn't earn it, that he was given it. How does it work? Well, not by connections or convention or compensation. Compensation, what is called legalism, says I work and God will pay me back. It's easy to understand. That's why it's so popular. But in Romans 9, the Apostle Paul quotes from God, from this very passage, and says in verse 11, that this shows that God had chosen Jacob, though they were not yet born, and had done nothing either good or bad. This passage proves that God does not work through compensation, because we compensate someone after they work. We agree, you will get paid so much an hour. And if you work an hour, well, then I'll pay you so much. It's quid pro quo. That's employment. It's compensation. But you have to do it first, and then you get paid. That's how it works. But here Jacob is chosen before he is even born. Notice God's choice of Jacob is declared in verse 23. He's still in the womb. He's not born yet, but he's the chosen one. Why? It's not because he did something. He's wrestling with Esau. What's going on then with that? Well, he'll always be doing that. But he's been chosen, not because he's being compensated. He hasn't had the opportunity to do anything to get compensated for. So we can conclude about legalism, that is salvation by compensation, from this very passage, that it doesn't work that way. Well, how does it work then? Third, some people think, these are the more sophisticated types, maybe it works not by sequential compensation like employment does. You know, you work, you get paid. But it works by, they think they're being really smart, by consequences. One prominent way of explaining both this passage and Paul's inspired interpretation of it in Romans 9 is that, sure, Jacob was chosen before he was born, and so before he could do anything to earn God's favor, but that's only because God, God being God, he can see all of the future, so he sees what Jacob will do. He can look ahead in the future and see that Jacob would believe. Jacob wants that birthright. He values it. And so God accepted Jacob based on him foreseeing Jacob's faith. He accepted Jacob as a consequence of Jacob's faith. It's really not any different than doing it after, but it sounds a little more sophisticated. It's really the same result. But anyway, that school of thought is what it's called Arminianism. That God's choice of who is saved is a result, as a consequence of our choice. That is, we choose to believe. God knows before we're even born that we will choose to believe, because he can see what will happen. He's looking down through the tunnel of history and sees we will believe. And so as a consequence of our free decision, he accepts us, our choice, is the cause of God's choice. Understand? That's the way they believe. It's really like compensation, except in this case, we're paid first. Paid with election, paid with being chosen. In other words, we're prepaid. But most bosses won't prepay us because they can't look into the future and be sure that we will actually do the work, but God can. He can be sure that we're going to repent and believe, and so as a consequence of that, of what we do, he pays us ahead of time with his favor, with salvation, with his choice. He pays us in advance. That's how it works, they say. The problems with that are at least three. Now, first, it makes God dependent on us. His actions, his decrees are a consequence or a result of ours, not the other way around. You understand? Whom he saves depends entirely on our choice, our will, not his. His will that some will be in heaven or some will be with him for eternity is dependent on what we do. Now, here, he would have seen that Jacob will want that birthright, and so God would choose Jacob for that. He decides to save us only because we decided to get saved. That's the way they think. He moves to bless us. He blesses Jacob with a birthright only because we decided to push the right buttons. And really, we made him. We made him choose us by choosing him. God then becomes a blessing and saving machine. And so one that you can study. You can understand. If you do thus and so, he will do that. Like a vending machine. You put in the right coins, you push that button, out comes that drink you just chose. And some people think that God is just like that. You put in the faith, the confession, you choose the salvation button, and out comes the salvation. It's like that. And he's a perfect one, so he never breaks down. So you can master it, you can get reproducible results. But even here, in this passage, with Isaac's prayer for Rebekah to conceive, verse 21 says the prayer, do you notice that word about the prayer? It's granted. It's granted. That word granted, it means given because of grace. Undeserved requests are granted. If you deserve it, you just demand it. Isaac could have said, I inherit Abraham's promise. Therefore, I confess Rebekah will have a child. I call it into being. It's a child of Abraham. That's what some people even teach now to treat God that way. Isaac didn't do that at all. He prayed, petitioned, and it was granted. It's not a right that is demanded and God somehow bound by spiritual laws that Isaac mastered. Isaac then applies it. And so God is made to do what Isaac says. Like we think of a magic word. That's what magic words do, right? They make the supernatural power come about. No, here, he pleads, he prays, he asks, and it is granted. God is not bound to compensate us for our works like he has to. Then salvation is not granted, it's earned. Or through our faith. We say the magic words, and out comes the product, the salvation. And he's not bound to whether he sees us have faith and confess either before or after. Now, he is the creator who created all the laws and is above them in Romans chapter 9, flowing out of the comments on this chapter in Genesis 25. Paul says, remember, God is the potter who makes us what he wants us to be. It's not the other way around. Second, back in Romans 9, the Apostle Paul says that this passage shows that God's choice of how salvation works is, in verse 11, not because of works. And again, it really doesn't make any difference to say that God compensates you before or after your works, including your faith. Either way, it's God's choice, God's salvation, what God does depending on us. Paul is saying that our salvation is not in any way a consequence of our actions or decisions. It's the other way around. Our faith, our good works, are a consequence of God's actions. As the Apostle John said, we love God and we love others because, why? Because we chose to? No, because God first loved us. Our actions, our faith and love are a consequence of God's actions. Third, to make God's choice a consequence of our choice totally forgets what kind of choices we will inevitably make left to ourselves. Our fallen hearts will not naturally choose the Lord. This chapter, I think, contains two pictures of what we're like left to ourselves. First, we're dead left to ourselves. Well, Paul says that in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 1. We're dead in our sins. Now, first, for the second consecutive generation, the promise that becomes the gospel of how the gospel will work to save people from sin, given to Abraham, is passed down through a woman who is infertile. Now, what are the chances of that? And remember about the story of Rebekah, that long chapter. Remember how long chapter 24 was? All about how Rebekah is especially chosen, God's providence. God went through all of that to find just the right woman for Isaac. And Isaac is the one through whom the promise is going to come. He's the one God is going to work to save his people. And yet, the woman God specially chose, it wasn't by accident, it wasn't a coincidence, it wasn't a mistake. Rebekah was the one. She's infertile. What? Why did God particularly choose an infertile woman? Well, Isaac married Rebekah when he was 40, and the twins are born when he's 60. So they're married 20 years, they're trying to have children, but she was infertile, just like Sarah. And that's the way our hearts are to faith. Our hearts are infertile to saving faith. We do not naturally produce that kind of life. So just as with Sarah, it takes a miracle. Now here Isaac prays and God grants the prayer. God reaches over the laws of nature because he created them. You know, to God, nothing's supernatural. Things are supernatural. Super means above nature when they're above our nature. But for God, everything is natural. Everything, there's nothing super that is above his nature. So he can do anything. He's not bound by what we call nature. He has to do the same thing, something super, what we call to us supernatural, to make us born again. So we'll have hearts that can believe, so we can be saved. Now some protest, but John 3:16 says, whosoever believes in him will be saved and have eternal life. Well, yes, but only those whom God grants the miracle of giving them a living heart, no longer infertile to believing, will believe in him. Only those are capable of belief. You know, not even John 3:16 says that everyone can believe and be saved. So some people think it says, whosoever believes, that means everyone can believe. No, it doesn't say that. It says, whoever believes will be saved. Now, many assume that means everyone can believe, but that makes no more sense than saying, you know, if I said, go by the Dan River or bridge, and I said, whoever swims across this river will get to the other side. Now, does that mean that everyone can swim? Am I saying that everyone can swim? Understand my analogy? If you will swim, you will get to the other side. But some people can't swim. If you will believe, you will be saved. But not everyone can believe. Indeed, none of us can believe until God gives us a new heart. Now, to imagine that God looks forward, sees the faith that we produce, all on our own, understand, just from our own dead hearts, we produce somehow, miraculously, this can be a miracle because we're doing it by ourselves, but whatever, we produce this faith. Someone who thinks that completely forgets that on our own, we cannot produce faith any more than Rebekah could produce a child, all on her own. Again, we know that Rebekah was found for Isaac by God's providence. That's what that long chapter was about. Why did God provide an infertile woman to be Isaac's wife? Why? Well, it's to show that we need God to produce his life. God has to do something we cannot do. It's not some technique that if we learn it, that we can master it and we can produce it. We can reproduce it at will. We think, well, we just need to muster up the faith. We need to say the right confession all by ourselves so we can produce that salvation. The right techniques, have those, or the means. that Finney talked about. The sacraments, some people say. You just do that, you find that, then you can produce the life. And God will see that even ahead of time, they say, and it'll give us salvation. If that's what you think, well, you forget that that's just not how we work. The second picture of here, what we're like on our own, all our own, why it's impossible to think that God will look forward to see our faith, that we produce somehow out of our own dead hearts, and compensate us for that ahead of time. The second illustration of that is Esau himself. Esau, as the firstborn, was due to inherit the promises to Abraham, what is called the birthright here. It was his right by birth, so they thought. He would naturally be the one who would inherit that promised land. He would be the one who would have as many offspring as the stars in the sky. He would be a blessing to the nations. All the promises that are fulfilled in the gospel would come through Esau. But after a hunting trip, he comes home. He's hungry. He sells all of that. Sees Jacob there by the stove or what they were doing at a fire. He's cooking. He's a quiet man. He's cooking. It's probably why his mother likes him. And he's willing to sell all of that. What becomes the gospel? He's willing to sell it for lunch. And the chapter ends noting that this was how Esau despised his birthright. I don't think that means he thought about it a little, just hated it. I hate this thing, I want to get rid of it. I think it means practically, when it came down to life, he valued it less than, I like that bowl of stew. It's worth less, they think. We think, people today. It's exactly the way people naturally think of the gospel today. The promise Esau had came the gospel. They think it's worth less than whatever will fill their stomach. It's worth less than making a few more dollars on Sundays. And so they work instead of hearing the gospel. It's worth less, they think, than getting good grades. So they do their homework and study instead of hearing the gospel. And that's not just Esau, understand. We don't stand back here and condemn Esau like how could he be so bad? That's how we all work. Well, people need is a new heart that loves God and clings to his promises, that is fertile ground for faith, that hungers more for the Lord and his word than for the best stew. But how does that work? How do you get that heart? We don't inherit it. We've seen that. We can't demand it as our just compensation for religious works well done. I've done the sacraments. I've paid the tithe. I've been to church. Therefore, give me what's mine, God. No. We can't expect God to prepay us as if he sees that we will eventually believe or do the right works and he will pay us heaven. No, we are infertile to faith. We naturally regard the gospel as worth less than lunch. So that's who we are. How does it work? It works by compassion. God's compassion. We see compassion portrayed in this passage. Isaac prays for his wife in verse 21. He was compassionate, and God was compassionate, granting the request. But most of all, we see compassion here for Jacob. Why Jacob? Is it because he's just a great guy, that Jacob? No, he's not even nice in this story. He should give his brother the stew. Esau is a hardworking man. He's out there hunting for the family. He should give his brother a bowl of stew for free. Thank him for his work out there. He doesn't. He's a jerk. You telling me Jacob was such a good guy? He earned God's favor? No, Jacob is a total jerk. No, I'm not going to share my stew with you unless you promise me your brother. What kind of brother does that? Then why does God choose him? Again, Romans 9, verse 15. It tells us explicitly how it works, how salvation works. God says, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. Now, don't let the fact that he doesn't have equal compassion on all distract you from the amazing wonder that he has chosen to have extravagant compassion on some, even you. Imagine, we're incapable of producing faith. We're infertile to true godliness. We naturally would rather have a bowl of stew than a relationship with God. And yet God chooses to have compassion on us. He chooses some to believe in the birthright, the gospel, that God will undo sin for us and accept us and make us new. That's nothing we can do. There's nothing we can master and reproduce at will. Nothing we would even want to do if left to ourselves. Like Esau, we have no appetite for God. We'll trade his promises. We'll trade a relationship with him for a good lunch, maybe for a few more dollars. Yet God in his mercy chooses to save. How does it work? He has compassion on whom he has compassion. Now, has he had compassion on you?